closely than the general public. So I probably don't need to recap too much on the history, and I'd much rather leave time for you to ask questions than give you a 20-minute presentation with death by PowerPoint. I'll start with some of the context, why this is an issue, skate over what we've just done as FATF and what are the main changes that we've made in the standards and the best practices, and then jump on to talk about next steps, because frankly, I couldn't agree with you more. This is not the end of the process. This is the start of the bit that really matters, which is where countries change their rules and implement them properly. And we have learned that the hard way. And we're going to have to help countries through the rest of the process rather than consider that it's over at this point. Anyway, the context, it's a very difficult conundrum. There are real cases in which terrorist groups have set up fake NGOs in order to finance or cover for their activities. There are also cases in which they've abused real NPOs, diverting funds to partners or collaborators. But those are very rare cases. The challenge is that those cases happen in places where the rule of law is fragile or the security situation is fragile. And those are the places where NPOs are most needed because they're compensating for weak or missing governments. And that makes it all the more important that in these environments, you not only don't exacerbate security problems by allowing NPOs to be abused, you also don't interrupt the, in many cases, absolutely essential work that they're doing in the absence of a secure environment and a capable government. So these are the most difficult situations that we find ourselves in, and that's where we've got a real dilemma, because acting or failing to act are both bad. Now, that's the very high level background. We've been aware collectively for probably 10 years of the increasingly common practice that countries have been over-regulating the NPO sector. Now, in some cases, this is innocent. They are acting in good faith, but they have not understood the FATF standards and they have maybe overestimated the risks. And that's led them to apply measures that have been excessive, not in proportion to the real underlying risks, and they've maybe put too much of a burden on or had a chilling effect on the activities of NPOs that are providing essential services. There are also, we believe, but I'm not going to name anybody, cases where countries have used the FATF standards as a cover or an excuse to deliberately suppress civil society because it articulates opposition to or exposes the weakness of their own government institutions. And the ambiguities and the misunderstandings in the FATF recommendations have given them some cover behind which they can plausibly deny that this was bad intention and say it was an innocent misinterpretation. But we haven't got the illusion that the standards have just been misunderstood. In some cases, they've been misunderstood deliberately. As an organization that's devoted to combating terrorist financing and that actually relies on partnerships with NPOs to deliver a lot of our policy objectives, we can't let either of those continue. So in 2016, we made some big revisions to the FATF standards. They were intended to clarify what recommendation 8 really meant, that not all NPOs are particularly vulnerable, that even those NPOs that meet our definition aren't all vulnerable, and that countries need to be targeted. And we made some quite extensive revisions to our standards then. We updated recommendation 8. We left it to countries to read and understand those changes and hoped that that would cure the problem. And as we all know, it didn't. Countries didn't necessarily change their laws, didn't necessarily change their approach, and the changes that we made then were perhaps wordy and almost as hard to understand as the original standards. So we had a comprehension gap, and that change didn't really lead to the difference on the ground that we had hoped. Now, I've got to give credit to your advocacy of the people in the room, particularly Leah and Sangeeta, but all of your partners in the Global NPO Coalition, for actually making us aware of this and giving us a window into what really was happening on the ground. And that was important, and it enabled us to take a different approach to the problem. And that different approach to the problem is what I'm mainly focused on. We started work a couple of years ago as part of the FATF's overarching project on mitigating the unintended consequences of the FATF standards. That looked at de-risking, which is also relevant to NPOs, whether you can get and maintain a bank account. It looked at the interaction of counter-terrorist finance rules with human rights, particularly due process and procedural rights. It looked at financial inclusion and financial exclusion if people are unable to reach a bank account because of identity requirements. And one of the 4 legs of it was revising Recommendation 8 to stop the FATF standards having a chilling effect on NPOs and NPO activity. So we revised Recommendation 8, and we've had a lot of conversations over the last 12 months probably about what the revisions were, what to expect, and where we were focused. And we, broadly speaking, we adopted the revised standards in October, and they were largely what we had expected and what we had already briefed you on. So there weren't any changes at the last minute in response to the consultation. But I will go through what's actually changed and what's different now. The first thing to highlight, though, is we've released not only revisions to our Recommendation 8, but also a best practices paper at the same time that has come out, so that there is a more in-depth explanation of what these changes mean and why they were put in place, but also of how countries can implement them. And I'll come to the fact that this is an innovative approach as well, really just to make sure that the message gets through this time. I think we might be the first organization, at least the first intergovernmental organization, to put out a best practices paper that is also a bad practices paper. So we have been very explicit in telling people what not to do. And this is part of a theme that you'll hear me talk about. We don't want to leave any people excuses for misunderstanding this innocently. We want to make sure that it is absolutely unambiguous what shouldn't be done, because the main reason for these changes was to make sure that we can have a proportionate approach that doesn't interfere with legitimate activity, rather than just allow people to think this is a change in the risk environment. Anyhow, let me move on to describe what we've done. We adopted changes to the standards and this best practices paper in parallel in October. And I'm going to pick out, I'll say, 6 main changes that are the most significant things. You can all see the red lines in the consultation paper, and on the FATF website, you can read the guidance for more detail. But the really significant changes, the first one is the objective. So in the FATF world, the recommendation sets out the very high-level principles. The interpretive note sets out in detail what countries are obliged to do, and the guidance sets out how they should do that in a non-binding way. We amended the highest level part, the recommendation, to set out very clearly the objective, which is to protect NPOs from the risk of terrorist financing misuse without unduly disrupting or discouraging their legitimate activities. And that last addition is something that should really be on ministers' radar when they're thinking about this. We've made it part of the objective that this should not be disruptive and should not limit legitimate activities. And that colors everything that comes afterwards, but it's important that we've stated this as the objective of our work. The second big change is about scope. And this has been the most misunderstood aspect of the recommendation from the beginning. So we have reframed it, re-emphasized it, and made it, I think, much clearer, and removed some of the ambiguities. Not all NPOs, not all of what the general public think of as not-for-profit organizations meet the FATF's definition. A lot of the sector is entirely outside the scope of the FATF standards, and it is wrong to expect those organizations to be subject to additional controls or rules. Even within the part of the NPO sector in ordinary language that meets the FATF's very technical definition, not all of those organizations and entities have a significant degree of terrorist financing risk. And our standards only apply to actually quite a very small subset that are engaging in activities that expose them to risk and that are actually vulnerable. And the biggest source of misunderstanding that we've seen in the last decade has been countries which have said every NPO has to do the following, or that there's looked at, even when they've looked at the ones that meet our definition, they have drawn the line in the wrong place. They have applied additional controls to maybe 50% of the NPO sector when really it's only justified in the case of 2 or 5% of the sector. So we've given them a much clearer idea of what is within the scope of the FATF standards and how narrowly drawn and targeted these measures need to be. And that's been the most persistent misunderstanding. And in some cases, we think that this is just countries are cautious. They don't want to be criticized by the FATF and they don't know what the number is that we're thinking of. So they guess and they make sure they guess higher. Well, by giving them a much clearer example of what we think the risks are, we can give them a license to go lower and to be much more targeted in how they approach this. So the scope is the second big thing. The third is reconnecting with risk assessment. And what we've set out is that most NPOs, most NPO activity, most NPO entities are low risk. And that the additional measures that countries apply where they think the risks are not low need to be grounded in a proper risk assessment. So the default is not to apply additional measures, but to do a genuine evidence-based risk assessment to identify if and where there is a segment of the NPO sector that does need some additional controls and safeguards and support to safeguard it. And the guidance makes much clearer how that should be done. And that includes engagement with the NPO sector to understand the risks, because we've seen these mistakes happen where a top-down risk assessment by a financial intelligence unit can drop on the NPO sector and nobody has ever heard anything about this before. Nobody's been consulted. Nobody has been invited to submit evidence or engage in the process. We've also seen good practices where countries have taken a collaborative approach and have worked with the sector to understand where the risks are and what could be done about it. And we've highlighted some of those approaches, which are a much better model. So the third big change is about risk assessment, and it's about making sure this is grounded in risk assessment and evidence-based. The fourth, I put it as an emphasis on the fact that we already required this, but people ignored it. That the measures that you put in place to mitigate those risks need to be focused and proportionate and relevant to the risks. It's not enough to say we've identified this subset of the NPO sector who are vulnerable, and therefore we're going to put in place these irrelevant, draconian, heavy measures. If they're disproportionate, if they're not mitigating the risks, then that's not consistent with the standards. And we've also set out quite clearly in the guidance, again, examples of what sort of things are and are not relevant. And this is one of the most important bad practices. So the bad practice of requiring suspicious transaction reporting as if an NPO was a financial institution is very clearly marked out as not risk sensitive and not appropriate. Project-based reporting, specific governance requirements, very low monetary thresholds for declaring donations are all singled out as bad practices in our guidance, in our best practices paper. And instead, we've set out good practices, which are things like having annual financial statements that provide details on income and expenditure, maintaining records of transactions and donations, having appropriate internal controls, and things like registration or licensing requirements where those are done for other reasons, like, for example, to apply tax exemptions. So we've set out much more clearly what is and is not an appropriate measure to mitigate the risk. And there are more in the best practices paper. That was number 4. Number 5 is a subset of this, but it's worth picking out specifically, which is we want to make sure countries take account of self-regulatory measures. NPOs operating in difficult environments, responsible ones anyway, almost always have their own internal controls and sort of collaborative umbrella organization-led sort of codes of practice that they can follow, because they're aware of these risks and are taking steps to mitigate them already. And we want to make sure countries look at and consider and take account of those self-regulatory measures when they're evaluating how much more risk remains to be mitigated after the sector has made its own good faith efforts to deal with these risks. And that hasn't happened in the past. We also want to make sure that even if those measures don't already exist, that the NPO sector has got a way out to escape from some of the oppressive measures that we've seen. And I wouldn't be very surprised if there are a few countries where those sorts of NPO sector codes of practice get started in the near future, because it might be better to self-regulate than have some regulation imposed from outside. And that really, it's to give you the choice in some cases. And then finally, I was going to come back to the best practices paper and the fact that it highlights worst practices as well. That's an important step that we haven't taken before, but we have in this case just because that's what we want to mitigate. So that's what's changed. It's not everything. You'll see much more detail in the standards and in the best practices paper, but I don't want to read out the whole thing. But the last point I want to make is it doesn't end here. We've seen the problem repeatedly, not just with recommendation 8, but with a lot of other recommendations where we, as a global standard setting body, we change the standards. And if we then lose focus, walk away, expect people to get on with implementing it seamlessly and perfectly, then we'll be disappointed. One of my other jobs at the moment is chasing up on whether countries have started regulating the crypto sector. 5 years after the FATF changed its standards, they're making progress, but there are a surprisingly large number of countries that aren't regulating it yet. That shows the need for us to carry on following up, chase countries about whether they have done this. Yes, it takes a couple of years to get laws and regulations passed, but also a couple of years is long enough to forget that you ever needed to, unless somebody is following up. So what we're doing, we are doing assessor training and training for countries on the changes to recommendation 8 and how they should and should not be regulating the NPO sector. We are updating our methodology, and we are going to be doing country assessments on the new standards when we start our 5th round of mutual evaluations next year. So we're going to be visiting every FATF member, and FSRBs will be visiting all of the regional body members over the next 6 years. And we'll be assessing them on the new standards, which means they can be marked down for doing too much. And that's a difference. We are doing awareness raising, not just this, but with governments as well, to make sure that the right people actually notice that the standards have changed and that there's something at stake. We're going to be making use of the channel we created some time ago, a couple of years ago, to get input from the NPO sector to our mutual evaluations. We publish our calendar. We've got a portal through which you can submit input, and we take that input very seriously, and it's going to be all the more important once we're assessing under the new standards, which we're not yet. And we're going to have a continued focus on this issue and on other unintended consequences of the FATF standards in the next couple of years. We're finalizing our work program in June. We have a ministerial meeting in April that will give us a high-level picture of what we need to do. But it's very clear our member countries are still very focused on this and aren't going to let us all forget about it. Now, that's what we're going to do, but I think there's more that you're going to need to help us with, and that's making us aware of where these problems exist, country by country, region by region, and actually helping us to disseminate this message to the right people, because we aren't going to necessarily reach them all at once. So I suspect we're going to have to carry on talking about it and working together just to make sure that this is now properly understood, and the revisions that we've just made to the standards actually stick this time. All right, let me stop there and then hand back to you.
Tom, thank you so much. I want to say to your point on including bad practices, I was at a workshop last week where we looked to FATF as kind of a standard that we could all follow in terms of inclusion of best practices when we talk about CFT or counterterrorism measures. So I think a lot of folks are looking to adopt that practice. So thank you for that. So maybe a quick overview of what Tom said about the biggest revisions. So he talked about objectives, scope, reconnecting with risk assessment, and measures needing to be proportionate and focused to actually mitigating the risk, and making sure countries take account of self-regulatory measures, and finally, the best practices paper, and making sure, as we just noted, that it's highlighting these bad practices. So I want to turn it over now to the audience. It looks like we have 2 questions so far. So Tom, I'll read those out to you, and then I welcome others to jump in if they have any more questions for Tom. So the first question comes from Lubin Panav, and it says, could we consider that the revised Recommendation 8 could also be applicable with regard to AML measures? For example, the fact that NPOs should not be reporting entities under R8, but a government may argue that they are reporting entities because of the AML risks. And the second comes from Casey Kelso, and it asks, in preparing foundations and philanthropies in Argentina to engage with the country visit of the Mutual Valuation Review later this month, how best should they get in touch with the FATF delegation? And I think that's what we have for now. So Tom, back over to you. Oh.
So the money laundering risks first. I see Ben Evans is in the audience, and he's possibly better qualified to answer this than me. The FATF Standards Recommendation 8 is originally a counter-terrorist finance measure specifically. When we integrated all of the special recommendations and the regular recommendations about 10, 12 years ago, we applied them across the board. But really, the risk that people are concerned about in the NPO sector is the terrorist financing risk. It's, at the time and since, it was more severe and more urgent and a threat to life rather than otherwise. There are lots of countries that have got separate regulatory measures to ensure the integrity of the NPO sector, and I've assessed a number of those countries where there's a strong emphasis, for example, through the UK Charity Commission or the equivalent in Sweden. There's a strong emphasis on enabling donors to have confidence that when they donate to a good cause, the money will be used properly, spent wisely, not frittered away on excess expenses or administration fees, etc. That's important, but that sort of thing is outside the scope of our standards. But if countries are applying anti-money laundering measures in the NPO sector, then just like everything else in Recommendation 8, those need to be proportionate and targeted and risk-based. And the reason I mentioned Ben Evans is he presented last year in Cambridge, and I'm sure again in your groups, some very good analysis that he did of where the money laundering risks appear in the NPO sector, the ways in which NPOs might be abused for money laundering purposes, which are different to terrorist financing purposes, different typologies, different techniques, but also that those risks are themselves relatively slight. So that's something to follow up. It's, if those measures happen, they need to be risk-based, and looking at the risks, there's some research out there which countries should be made aware of if they're not already. Second question on Argentina. The good news is my colleague Claire, who led the work on the revision of Recommendation 8, is one of the assessment team in Argentina at the moment. They started this week. So the team is very, very well aware of the standards in this area. However, we're not yet assessing on the new standards. Because the evaluation process is such a long one, Argentina submitted all of its technical information months ago before we had revised the recommendations, and we have to assess them under the old Recommendation 8, albeit with the understanding that we have of what it was supposed to mean all along, even if it was ambiguous. In terms of providing them information, they're already there. They already have their on-site schedule, and they've been doing meetings for the last 4 days. So if you've got additional information to submit, then submit it as soon as possible. ideally this week. There is a portal on the FATF website through which you can send it, but otherwise, if you want to provide it by email, then I don't know if it's fair to ask Sangeeta or Leah to act as a postbox or send it to us. But make sure it gets to us one way or another, and we can make sure it gets to the assessment team if they need to see it. I think that was it, but I see some other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So maybe, Ben, if you want to jump in just very briefly, and then we'll do these next 3 questions. And then I'm afraid we'll have to move forward so we don't fall too far behind. So Ben, if you want to jump in real quick. Ben, I think now you're able to unmute. Sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah, thanks, Tom. So just for everyone's, just to let you know that, yeah, we did do some research. Vanja, who's on the call here with us as well, was part of that research into money laundering, and how that's manifested itself in 16 countries we looked at around the globe. As Tom said, we found that there were some cases, but not enough cases to suggest this was a systemic problem. What the important difference, I think, for money laundering as opposed to terrorist financing is there was much more specificity about how it was manifested. So it took particular forms depending on particular countries, and specifically in relation to the particular regulatory regime within a country. So, you know, it was there to exploit a gap or a loophole within that regime. So we would expect to see, I think, very different approaches in different countries. What I think, to Lubin's point, though, I think the useful thing is, you know, with terrorist financing recommendation 8, we have a clear set of guidelines on how that should be interpreted by authorities. What we're still lacking, though, is that kind of clarity when it comes to money laundering, and the concern being that countries will say, oh, our terrorist financing risk is low, but our money laundering risk for NPOs is high, and that therefore justifies making them obliged entities for money laundering purposes and not terrorist financing purposes. We've always tried to argue by analogy that the same principles that apply on terrorist financing apply on money laundering, but that's not explicitly said anywhere, and that's the kind of thing I think that perhaps Lubin was getting to and that we would like to see.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. And everyone, please feel free, if you'd like to ask a question or make an intervention, please just raise your hand or put in the chat that you'd like to. I think we have the settings so that I have to unmute everyone individually, but I will be sure to do that. So I think we're only going to be able to take the next 3 questions, and then we're going to have to keep it moving, just being mindful of the time. So Tom, we've got 2 questions that have a humanitarian focus. So one, if you could outline a bit on the inclusion and reference of humanitarian exemptions into the revised recommendation 8. And then another one about some measures that folks are being asked by some institutional donors is about screening beneficiaries of humanitarian assistance against sanctions and CT lists, and that they consider it to be incompatible with humanitarian principles. And so wondering about your view on whether FATF considers that proportionate to risk. And then lastly, clarifying what measures the FATF is taking in developing the upcoming AML regulation in the EU to protect NGOs from de-risking. Yeah, if you could speak to those 3. I'm sorry we can't take the rest, but thanks, Tom. Back over to you.
Right, you're picking the most difficult parts then. I'll start with the last, which is maybe easier. We've been speaking with the Commission and the EBA about this. My understanding, first of all, the FATF doesn't have a unique insight into the European legislative process because they are one of our members, but we have to stay at the sort of global level, and that's a separate process. So we don't have a window into the trialogue. Thank God, because it's a long and painful process. But I do understand from discussions with them that they're still working on rules or guidelines about access to basic bank accounts, for example. And we've been discussing with them in the context of financial inclusion how their new regulation and the guidelines that they're developing to back it up are going to establish rights to a bank account. There are a number of EU countries which consider that this is a basic right, and they establish a right to a bank account. And countries like France and the Netherlands have got quite active programs on that area. There are others for whom this is new, and I think that's a discussion that's still going on. So my understanding is that this is still on the table, but maybe it's not in the regulation. It's also worth noting the FATF is working at the moment on possible changes to Recommendation 1 and Recommendation 10, because we're focused on financial inclusion as well. And that's where what we're looking at is how can we enable countries to make use of simplified due diligence measures? In other words, lighter identity verification requirements, lighter account opening procedures, specifically to enable people who maybe have less documentation or less of a transaction history to access banking services. So that's work in progress, but we're hoping that we can make progress on that issue in the year ahead, I think. Humanitarian and screening. The text that we've got around being compatible with international human rights, refugee law, humanitarian law, it's not, I don't think, carving out a particular exemption. It's more referring back to the UN Security Council resolutions that and other conventions that set out what's required in this area. We want to make sure that countries are aware of them, but the FATF is not the right body to rewrite or interpret international humanitarian law. So I don't have a great deal more that we can say about that, other than the fact that often this is not a factor that people take into account when they're applying Recommendation 8 at national level, and the changes we've made are to make sure that they consider this. Sanctions screening is one of the most difficult issues that you come across, simply because the costs and the risks are both so much greater. You still need to have a proportionate approach, but there have been cases in which humanitarian assistance has been abused or misdirected. There are cases in which it's been withheld and that has had extremely grave consequences. And this is a genuinely difficult thing for operational authorities to deal with. Perhaps I'll stop there and see if there are one more round of questions if people have them.
We do have more questions, but unfortunately, I think we're going to have to keep the webinar moving just so that we can get to all of the speakers. So apologies for folks if we weren't able to get to your questions. Tom, thank you so much. Really appreciate all of your insights and being here with us today. So now let's move to Claudia. Claudia, really excited to hear your insights and what you have to share with us as well. So you've worked across an impressive 16 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So how do you envision these changes to Recommendation 8, and just taking note of everything that Tom shared with us, and with the revisions to the Interpretive Note and the best practices paper impacting the LAC region? And what will it take for these changes at the normative level to trickle down to the regional level?
Thank you, Ashley. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Yes, perfect. Thank you. So again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for this opportunity for asking such a relevant question. Just to let you know that our team has started sharing these changes to Recommendation 8. And for us, it's quite clear that these improvements are very welcome by NPOs and countries where we are working right now. Moreover, the publication of best practices papers is seen as particularly beneficial, offering clear guidance on interpreting Recommendation 8. Now, turning to your questions, we envision these changes will impact the region in at least 3 key areas. First of all, we think that these updated standards may become the most relevant tool for NPOs' efforts in engaging with authorities when advocating for revisions to the AML and CFT regimes in their countries. We think that by helping NPOs understand and use these positive changes, they will be better prepared to collaborate effectively with authorities in countries open to such engagements. For instance, partners in Mexico are working right now on guidelines or protocols, as they call them, to help financial institutions better design their de-risking policies impacting NPOs. We have encouraged them to include elements of these positive changes to Recommendation 8 in these guidelines, which financial institutions may consider when reviewing their policies and practices towards the sector. We also support similar efforts NPOs are carrying out with government officials in countries like Honduras, Peru, and Guatemala, hopefully. Secondly, we think that these changes will provide a clear roadmap for government officials when interpreting Recommendation 8 and designing compliance measures. The new legal measures applied to NPOs could be more in line with Recommendation 8, and others that are not could be withdrawn. At least that's what we hope. However, as Tom mentioned, officials will need technical assistance to do this, and in some countries, the lack of training and resources usually results in poorly drafted legal measures, even if the intentions do not aim to disincentivize the NPO's legitimate activities. And lastly, the last area we think these changes will have an impact on is the regional standards addressing best practices for the life cycle regulation for NPOs. In March last year, the Inter-American Juridical Committee of the Organization of American States approved 12 principles to guide states in drafting life cycle laws for NPOs. Precisely, Principle 8 refers to the state's responsibility for implementing FATF standards through proportionate laws based on evidence of risk. We believe that current revisions to Recommendation 8 will help them reinforce such standards, which in turn will be used by NPOs and other regional stakeholders to advocate for better regulations in the region. And that's how we think these changes can trickle down at the regional level right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Claudia. So now that you've shared these regional level changes, I'd like us to try and drill down even further to the country and to the local level. So how will these revisions have impacts at the national level? And could you share some specifics in both the Nicaragua and El Salvador context? And then a little bit drilling down even further about how they can impact the local level.
Yes, thank you. I think it is important to recognize that the nonprofit organizations previously dissolved for alleged non-compliance with laws inspired in Recommendation 8 may not be immediately benefit for these changes, particularly in Nicaragua, where hundreds of NPOs have lost their legal status due to Recommendation 8 inspired legislation. Unfortunately, Nicaragua is not slated for the 5th round of mutual evaluations until 2032. And that makes it unlikely that the revision to Recommendation 8 will be applied anytime soon. So our colleagues from Nicaragua urge FATF to prompt the country's authorities to review the current AML-CFT regime, potentially through a special procedure to mitigate the adverse effects on policy and on those poorly performing countries. Such a procedure should include the revisions to Recommendation 8 without any delay, just right now. We eagerly await updates from GAFILAT, the FATF regional body, on efforts to design such a mechanism, incorporating, hopefully, the revisions to Recommendation 8, and we expect to see an short-term implementation plans for this country. Now, turning to El Salvador, our efforts are in line to ensure that it doesn't face a situation akin to Nicaragua. Currently, the country is undergoing the 4th round of mutual evaluations, and just back in January, evaluators met with representatives of NPOs who presented evidence of the country's legal measures falling short of Recommendation 8 compliance, hindering their operations. The partners, through reports and other engagement with GAFILDAT, have made a point of treating the recent updates as a product of lessons learned, arguing that the updates represent the most accurate interpretation of previous language. And we understand that while evaluators were receptive, right now it is challenging to predict what the ultimate outcome of the evaluation process will be regarding recommendation 8. Additionally, even if in the face of a negative evaluation on this point, there's uncertainty whether authorities will consider revising the AML CFT regime as it applies to NPOs, especially with the re-election of Mr. Bukele. In the end, though methodological changes may not occur quickly, we think that indicated in the mutual evaluation report how past misapplications resulted in lessons learned that have informed recommendation 8 revisions should bolster the case for revising the country's AML CFT regime. And that's what we hope, and that's what we're aiming for. Thank you for the opportunity again.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the Latin America and Caribbean region. And I think there's all country contexts probably share in the hope that the changes are able to trickle down to the domestic AML CFT changes and regulations. So really appreciate you sharing that with us. So now for this next part of the webinar, we are going to have an in-depth discussion about the excellent and timely report that the Human Security Collective put out late last year that's titled The Future of FATF Recommendation 8, a Foresight Piece. So we're lucky to have with us today a number of the researchers and authors of that report. So let's jump in with them. So Talia, I'd like us to start with you. If you could share with us a little bit about how the research for this Foresight piece came about, and if you can share with us also a bit about the methodology and the background behind it. And before I hand it over to you, I just want to encourage everyone to read the report because it's excellent and gives a lot of really timely and relevant recommendations. Also welcoming Zach, Charity and Security Network's comms consultant, to the webinar. He's going to try to help us have everyone be able to unmute themselves.
Great. Can you all hear me well? Okay, wonderful. Together with our coalition members at the Global NPO Coalition on the FATF, we've been submitting instances of de-risking and NPO suppression to the Secretariat and the FSRBs for a long time. We've also welcomed their efforts to address the real challenges stemming from the implementation of Recommendation 8, including the changes in 2016, the unintended consequences work streams, and the newer changes that Tom just highlighted. Working in this space for as long as we have, though, we've come to question whether changes to the text would be enough to move the needle on such an intractable issue. And if not, we sort of asked ourselves what would. So in this Foresight piece, we take a bit of a wider view and set out to interrogate whether getting rid of Recommendation 8 would help alleviate the unwarranted overregulation, suppression, and financial exclusion to which civil society has been subjected. It's intended to provide some food for thought for further discussion for those of us working at the intersection of protection of civic space and then the regulation of civil society for the prevention of money laundering and terrorism financing. So the report has been funded by the Funders Initiative for Civil Society. Just to say a little bit of our methodology, the findings are based on 27 in-depth interviews that we conducted with representatives of NPOs, the FATF, the World Bank, the IMF, governments, banks, researchers, academics. We also analyzed materials produced by the FATF, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms while countering terrorism, civil society organizations, think tanks, academics. So some of the questions that we set out to address was, what would a world without the FATF Recommendation 8 look like? Would it help alleviate the unintended consequences of the implementation of this framework on civil society and civic space? And then what does the Global NPO Coalition on the FATF and other relevant stakeholders on the issue need to focus on moving forward? So based on our interviews, we came to sort of formulating a dual lens when looking at this question. So one, we named sort of the evolutionary approach. So would it be better or more effective stick to a more evolutionary approach, seek to keep redefining the recommendation and how it's implemented? Or would it be more prudent to go for a more revolutionary approach to look and reimagine how nonprofits are dealt with in the framework altogether? So based on this lens, we looked at it at the recommendation itself. We looked at the national context, so how countries are interpreting it, and then that of the market. My colleagues will go a little bit more into this.
Great. Thank you so much, Talia. Okay, Flor, now we're going to hand it over to you. Thanks for teeing up your presentation. So based on what Talia has just shared with us, can you share more about how this plays out in the country context?
Sure, and the reason we created some slides is because there's a lot of information in our research, so we wanted to just visually kind of show you the main elements of the different chapters. So please have a read if you want more details on this. So first of all, at the national context level, the title of our chapter is Using a Cannon to Kill a Mosquito, which I think summarizes a little bit how we see it and how we've analyzed it. And the issues playing out at national level have, of course, different elements. Some that we want to highlight now are, first of all, the context in which these kind of soft law rules of counterterrorism have been created, or the soft law ecosystem, as the UN Special Rapporteur calls it, were created with very limited knowledge or background of human rights, which meant that, well, a system was able to develop that really kind of marginalized human rights and focus specifically on the counterterrorism angle, which of course plays out at the national level in different ways. Even though it may be a soft law ecosystem, initially at the national level, these standards have become very hard law, which have real consequences for civil society groups on the ground. And what we see is that after mutual evaluations, there's often an explosion of new NPO regulations that have become or will become hard law, which are the issue, the greatest issue on the table, I would say. And some have even said that the action of kind of creating new regulations is rarely motivated by actually reducing harm, but really being able to show that something is being done, for example, about the NPO sector, and which is why these limiting regulations are implemented. Now, these are kind of the contextual kind of factors we're dealing with in our chapter, but also, of course, there's some more concrete kind of procedural issues that play out on the ground, which have to do with the way that data is gathered during mutual evaluations, using universal benchmarks to kind of apply to a very various topics, which don't always play out the same in each country, and reliance on often unverified information from, for example, social media posts or other sources in which NPO sector itself naturally had not been able to comment on, which also, of course, have to do with kind of the assessor qualities, or the ones that are doing these assessments at national level, which often also have a limited knowledge of civil society. So there's procedural elements and kind of structural elements that we highlight. Now, of course, I'll jump right into the answer of the main question of the paper, which is, will the removal of Recommendation 8 solve all of these problems? Well, in the best quote I think we found is, the ghost of Recommendation 8 will remain, which meant that, well, the majority of people that we spoke to and looking at the literature, we found that actually laws inspired by Recommendation 8 have already been enacted in many places and implemented. So removing Recommendation 8 at this stage may, in those cases, not have a huge effect. Of course, in some countries where these processes are still taking place, the non-existence of Recommendation 8 may have a positive effect, but overall, actually, we were quite surprised initially to see from everyone that we spoke to that removing it at this stage may even be disadvantageous, because it's also been able to open up the door to FATF, of course. There's quite a bit of attention to this issue. And in the words of one person, it would mean giving up what we fought so hard for, which is nuanced guidance and the exceptionalism of this actual NPO sector, and being able to create also nuance and how diverse this sector really is, and being able to bring more understanding out about that. Of course, we do have recommendations on what should happen if we will not remove recommendation 8. And that's mostly specifically focused, of course, on assessor qualities, but also human rights expertise within the FATF itself. And quote of one person, the simple reference to international law without pointing towards specifics is meaningless. So really having people on the ground, but also within potentially the FATF team that really understand human rights law and humanitarian law so that it's integrated into standards and not just mentioned. And some suggestions that we propose are formalizing relations with human rights bodies, such as the UN Special Rapporteur, and meaningful engagement, of course, with NPOs throughout the mutual evaluation cycle, which makes sure that the right information reaches these assessors. Now, of course, there's also some recommendations we are kind of giving to FATF as an institution specifically. And one, I think, to highlight here is an early warning and response system, which would, for example, allow NPOs to flag potential harmful laws before they are being implemented, and making sure also that the FATF is slightly more explicit about the bad behavior in that regard. Of course, the bad practices paper, even the best practice paper, which also covers bad practices, is a good start for that, I would say. But more explicit kind of mentioning of those issues can still help quite a lot. And then finally, we mentioned it before, of course, the quality of the assessors. If human rights were part of their thinking, one person said in the assessment, it would be the first thing that they would ask human rights. But now at the moment, questions in mutual evaluations are still very much focused on risk and finance. And also the assessors themselves often have a finance background, which doesn't facilitate the human rights inclusion in evaluations. And a proposal we make is, for example, to add someone from the NPO sector to these assessor teams to make sure that indeed the relevant issues are targeted, potentially creating minimum quality standards for assessors and a targeted training approach that includes a human rights focus to really build that sincere human rights expertise. Of course, there's more recommendations in the paper, but for now, I'd like to leave it at that. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Floor. I think this question, the main question of the research, is the one we were all very interested in hearing what the findings would yield about should R8 be removed. So yeah, knowing we've seen the ghost be there with us since inception. So it makes maybe unfortunate sense, but makes sense that it would still remain with us long beyond now. And then just really want to elevate your points on about human rights, and that if human rights have to be specific, otherwise they're meaningless. And if human rights are truly part of the thinking, that they would be the first question asked. And then also your recommendation on addressing this by having NPOs be more integrated and be a part of evaluations and assessments. So thank you so much for that. So Sangeeta, now I'd like to move to you. If you could share with us how the third element that you discuss in the report, talking about the market and how that's implicated in all of the research that you did.
Thanks very much, Ashley. And as you can see, we've termed our chapter "Markets Are Dancing to Another Drumbeat." And as we've been hearing, while sort of the normative standards are set at the international level, it is at the national level that the implementation takes place, with states giving life to the norms through rules, laws, and regulations, and the market actually operationalizing the rules. And what do we mean by the market? Of course, it includes banks, financial institutions, but it's not just banks. The category also includes, for example, companies who provide risk solutions to banks and others, or consultants who help disseminate the regulatory framework. So really the whole gamut of the political economy that has developed around this regulatory framework. Now, banks, as an interviewee mentioned, were effectively placed on the grey list in 2001, having been made gatekeepers in terms of upholding financial integrity, a role they really did not ask for. And if you think about it, is at odds with their function as a commercial profit-making entity. Recent estimates suggest that almost 1 in 5 employees is now working on compliance, performing Know Your Customer or due diligence checks. The chapter seeks to interrogate this downstreaming of the management of risk to private actors such as banks, and asks whether governments, instead of tackling the proximal causes that lead to terrorism and terrorism financing, are not instead using technical fixes such as compliance, risk management, auditing, etc., to try and fix what are in effect social, political, and economic problems. And in terms of the market, a revolutionary approach we suggest would entail a recalibration of the concept of risk. And there are two prongs of this that we outline. One is to construct risk in a manner that is more multidimensional than it is now. So risk as a concept today only reflects the potential terrorism financing risk to the state. It does not take into account the multitudes of other risks. The risk, for example, of an overly securitized approach, including the misuse and abuse of the financial integrity frameworks by governments, which hamper legitimate charitable activity, whose work actually, through whether that is through humanitarianism, through development, through human rights, or through peace building, contributes to the mitigation of that very same terrorism risk. So it is important to ask what risk and whose risk we are considering when we speak about the risk-based approach, and what we miss when risk is not thought about holistically. And the second prong that we talk about is really interrogating the foundational aspects of how risk is seen today. We have sort of become risk societies where risk is adjudged not based on scientific data or statistical data or the mode of strict possibility, as an academic points out, or rather strict probability, but actually it's become more possibilistic. So it's about, whether something is possible, whether something is suspicious. So it's based on preemption or imagination. And I think this sort of possibilistic mode needs reining in. And we need to go back to sort of the mode of strict probability, which is more scientifically based, and based on statistics, if we are to be effective in fighting financial crime. And in terms of the evolutionary, I think there needs to be a rethink on where the risk-based approach sits and whether it is better served by moving it from the regulated, so from the financial institution or the bank, to the regulator. So what we need, in effect, as one interviewee told us, is a rule-based approach for everyone, but a risk-based approach for the bigger players. So our research actually indicated that the risk-based approach is inappropriate for smaller regulated institutions, for example, because it's too resource intensive. And also, there is an underlying assumption there that the industry as a whole, so the market, the regulated banks, would be better at identifying and managing risk than the regulators or the supervisors. So, our interviewees pointed out that a rule-based approach, of course, would not be without risk consideration, but the identification and calibration of that would lie with the regulator and not with the regulated. And just to give you an example, the Netherlands has actually recently initiated such a move aimed at this recalibration. So the Dutch Banking Association, supported by the central bank, which is the supervisor, and the Ministry of Finance, which is the legislator, has come up with a set of sector baselines for nonprofit organizations. So banks are initially meant to see nonprofits as neutral, as opposed to before, when the entire sector was seen as high risk for terrorism financing. That was the case in the Netherlands. So now they would apply a risk lens. So you come in as neutral, and then you apply a risk lens to do what they call more if necessary, less if possible in terms of due diligence. So there is this sort of recalibration taking place. And I think, that is where we need to go going forward. And additionally, and this is where I'll finish, I think there needs to be a proliferation of multi-stakeholder dialogue processes, which are already taking place in many contexts. And this needs to happen at national, regional, international levels to find technical fixes, systemic fixes to financial access challenges facing NPOs. NPOs need to be included in the design and development of financial crime compliance solutions. The market needs to be engaged actively on changes in the norms and guidance. So, as we were saying, its policy is one thing, the normative level is one thing, but it needs to trickle down, not just to the national level, but also to the market. which is ultimately the gatekeeper. And last but not least, there needs to be thought given to creating incentives for financial institutions to bank nonprofits. So you create demand from the market to solve the problem of NPO de-risking. So I think I'll stop there, Ashley, and hand back to you.
Thanks so much, Sangeeta. So I think key thing for us to continue asking ourselves is what risk and whose risk. Being mindful of time, Flor and Talia, if I could encourage you to be a bit quick in these next questions so that we can make sure we have time for Vanja and Rose. So Flor, if you could talk us through a little bit around the accountability of FATF as a body and what you found about this.
Yes, well, maybe others share this same sentiment, but I remember when I started learning about FATF, I was quite surprised that an institution that is a task force has so much influence, but also that actually there's very little ways to be able to hold them meaningfully accountable, especially considering the considerate unintended consequences and damage that some of the recommendations have done at the national level, of course, and to CSOs worldwide. So because it's not a treaty body, of course, the FATF, they also therefore evade some sort of legal accountability, right? And so people that have a legal background are probably also quite surprised, like, what is it then? What kind of institution is it? And even some of the FATF staff or people that we talked to said, well, we did some legal analysis internally also to kind of assess what legal status we truly have and maybe what we should be in order to be a more effective organization. So there has been some research done on kind of formalizing the legal status of FATF into an official international organization and what the potential advantages and disadvantages are. So we dove a little bit further into that in our interviews as well, also with this academic background of Tilahun as a background. I really recommend you to read some of his work. He really presented interesting dilemmas here. And indeed, formalizing the legal status of FATF, yeah, what would it bring? It would indeed provide an avenue for legal action, potentially, like legal action can also be taken to international institutions such as the World Bank or other UN bodies, even though that legal route is not easy and also not completely functioning, but at least there is one. And it would provide normative clarity and some peer accountability also, because of course it would be an institution among others, which would increase kind of this peer accountability element. Now, kind of opposing or kind of contradicting that with the other option, which is keeping the organization as is, there actually were some advantages to that, according to the people that we spoke to and the academic studies that have been done on this, which means that actually now there's quite a bit of agility within the FATF to respond to certain issues. And if the FATF would transform its legal status, and the bureaucracy potentially would also be strengthened and would increase, which would maybe make them less agile. And there were actually some disadvantages posed, at least, to transforming that legal status. And one person actually kind of summarized that well, I think, in this quote, which is why kill the golden goose. Now we have FATF as also a discussion partner. We can invite them to webinars like this, and they can be quite agile in responding to potentially certain recommendations. Now, saying that FATF shouldn't formalize its legal status into an international organization doesn't mean that, at least our paper proposes, that we should add more checks and balances to the current system, because there is very little at the moment. And some options that were proposed were creating, for example, a FATF ombudsman, something that RUSI has also proposed in the past, which means that it's a person who would be able to take certain complaints and be able to deal with those internally and report about those externally, because of course transparency is a really big part of accountability, and of course transparency, I think, at the FATF, especially about how certain information is dealt with internally, could definitely be strengthened. And there are some ombudsmen, like in Ireland and the UK, that have dealt with issues of de-risking. So if an ombudsman were created, then those could be kind of sought out for advice. And that's, well, a key recommendation that we would give in our paper. And following that, the transparency is not even just on the decision-making process, but also how especially input to the FATF is being addressed. At least I think NPOs, and that's what our paper also poses, should be able to know what happens to the input that they give, and they work very hard to give as well, and how it's being integrated. And then I think we can end with this quote, which is, a non-institution creating soft law standards should not have as much power as the FATF without appropriate checks and balances. And I think this sentiment is something that came up in the majority of interviews of people that we spoke to. So something indeed can be improved on this transparency and accountability angle. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Flor. So Talia, if you could bring us home with the concluding insights.
Yeah, so my colleagues were generous in terms of sharing a lot of our recommendations already, which you can find in the report. Just to highlight, a lot of what we've been talking about are ways in which the FATF and areas in which, as civil society, we can work to stop current NGO suppression and de-risking. Some of that, include looking at the disproportionate weight given to NPOs, for example, in the immediate outcomes. But also, there are some dilemmas which the report really focuses on also at the end that underlie much of our thinking around risk and around terrorism financing and money laundering that require some reconsideration. One of them, Sangeeta mentioned, in terms of rethinking an overly securitized approach and looking more at what is probable rather than what is possible, rethinking where the risk-based approach sits. Others that we think are really important to consider are banks as public utilities. So should bank accounts be seen as a public good? What is the responsibility? Since it is very difficult to function in the world without a bank account, what does it look like when banks act with due diligence to avoid overzealous or unnecessary de-risking? And another that we think is taken for granted, but really requires some further interrogation, is that counterterrorism financing was attached to the existing anti-money laundering architecture after 9/11. They are two very different beasts, as was pointed out by many that we spoke to for this report. So should counterterrorism financing not logically reside elsewhere, more with the counterterrorism sanctions architecture? Would that maybe result in less policy incoherence? So those are some broader, more fundamental questions that we really think requires more interrogation and more conversation.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to all of our great researchers and authors. I put the report in the chat and really encourage everyone to read it. It's a wealth of information and you will learn a lot. So I really want to encourage everyone to stay with us because we have two final panelists who have some excellent thoughts to share. So Vanja, let's start with you. So we've talked a bit about the revisions to Recommendation 8 and the Interpretive Note and the Best Practices paper. And we know that these come after FATF's completion of the Unintended Consequences workstream and years of civil society advocacy around Recommendation 8 and its impacts. We also know civil society is eager for the changes to translate into action and to move beyond words on a paper. And we do believe that FATF is eager for this as well. So it would be helpful for all of us to understand from you how we can make this happen. So if you could share with us a bit about how to connect the gap between the normative framework level and the country level.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ashley, and thank you to all the panelists before me. It's really an important discussion that we are having here. I would focus on two key points that are really crucial for successful implementation of the new revised recommendations and best practice paper. And some of it Tom already mentioned, but I would like to expand on it. The first point is training and education of both the evaluators as well as the governments that are implementing the standards. And here we really expect the FATF and regional bodies, the FSRBs, to take concrete action quickly and hopefully intensively in order to avoid, for example, waiting for 5 years for the revisions to be implemented, as we heard that it sometimes takes a lot of time, because we really can't wait anymore for this to be quickly implemented. And one imminent need is to provide a streamlined approach towards dissemination and clarifying all the new revisions and guidance to the governments. Now, I'm glad to hear that some steps have been taken in that direction by the FATF. but we really hope it includes more than just 1 or 2 FATF staff going around and explaining this. So we are doing that from the nonprofit side too, right? So we need to inform our own colleagues and our own sector in how to ask for better implementation of the revisions. However, we do see the need to have a more of a multi-stakeholder approach and discussions where possible. So everyone's efforts are aligned with the new standards and guidance. And here, for example, this could happen at the regional level for FSRB meetings or plenary sessions, where we could have sessions or events at that level by inviting nonprofits and civil society colleagues to participate, having dedicated discussions on the revised recommendation 8 and best practice paper with the governments in the region and the banks and the private sector. So this in particular features disseminating and discussing some of the bad examples from the guidance that Tom mentioned as best practices, and the discussion, honest discussion, I would say, with the governments and FSRBs and FATF. How can we revert some of these bad practices that are existing now that have been implemented in the name of the FATF standards in the last years? The second one is methodology of the assessment that needs to explicitly reflect revisions, and this is also something that Tom mentioned. I would just add that if country measures really disrupt or discourage or restrict legitimate activities of civil society, these should be clearly noted and addressed in the evaluation reports. We want to see that. We also want to see here the engagement of the nonprofit sector, and therefore we truly need a more streamlined approach on how to involve civil society into country assessments also on the regional level. So not everything going through the FATF, through this one email at the portal from the FATF Secretariat. So I would stop here with these two really, really concrete and imminent steps that need to happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanja. I think everybody shares in your wanting more NPO and civil society inclusion kind of more deeply embedded in different levels of FATF. So Rose, now we're going to go over to you. So we heard earlier in the webinar from Claudia about the revisions and how they'll impact the LAC region. So I want to ask the same question to you, but in your context and how you envision these revisions having impact on the Southern African region and what it will take for kind of the same that we just asked Vanja, for the changes to trickle from the normative to the regional level.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and organizing this webinar. It has really been helpful to hear from the Financial Action Task Force representative. Maybe just to say for us as civil society organizations or not-for-profit organizations that are working in the Southern Africa development community, we have been seeing a general trend over the last few years where the governments are introducing laws in response to the mutual evaluation processes and the outcomes that are not favorable to them, where the ratings are showing that there are some deficiencies. So a number of countries have been introducing laws which, upon analysis, are actually going to be restricting civic space if they are allowed to pass. So some of these laws are still at proposal stages, and luckily for now, most of the countries with the laws that would be restrictive have not yet been passed. They are at different stages of formulation. So some of the countries where laws have been proposed in reaction to the Financial Action Task Force mutual evaluation process include Mozambique, where there were proposals to change the NGO law. It has not yet been passed. And then we also have South Africa having introduced several amendments impacting on not-for-profit organizations, which include amendments to the Not-for-Profit Organizations Act that was passed. And then we have Angola, where there's a proposal to amend and introduce a bill that will impact on the registration and status of not-for-profit organizations, which is the law on the status of NGOs bill, which was introduced in May 2023. And of course, the other country that we also see a law having been introduced to respond to the Financial Action Task Force is Zimbabwe, which I'll be dealing with later on. So in terms of the changes in the normative framework that have been introduced, particularly with the interpretive notes issued late last year by the Financial Action Task Force, at the regional level, I do see that there's an opportunity for us to lobby as not-for-profit organizations within the SADC region as a collective to ensure that governments do not necessarily rush to introduce laws that will lead to closure of civic space, but for them to consider some of the issues that have been raised in the interpretive notes, particularly around issues to do with self-regulation of the sector, and also issues around internal controls of the sector, but also the undertaking of risk assessments first before laws are introduced. And I would want to highlight that some of the colleagues who are joining this webinar, like colleagues from Mozambique, have been successful in terms of instituting risk assessments as a sector. And other countries from the region can also maybe push that governments resort to instituting risk assessments first, where there is participation, active participation from the sector before some of these laws are introduced, so that we do not have a bad precedent being set by one of the countries. We have noted that within the SADC region, once one country introduces a law, then there's a possibility that the rest of the other countries will follow suit to emulate and copy that bad law. So we do hope that this opportunity is going to be something that we can rely on as civil society organizations, and also to highlight that there's a need for the Eastern Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group and other stakeholders to take the initiative of increasing awareness on the changes that are introduced by Recommendation 8, of course, working together with the Financial Action Task Force. Because once the laws pass, it will be very difficult to reverse them. And from the trends that we are seeing, particularly with the more repressive proposals, none of those laws have actually been passed at the SADC level. And then we would also, as a sector within the region, look at how we can also be proactive to do more advocacy with targeted governments around highlighting some of these changes in the interpretive notes that can guide them to comply with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. And also maybe highlight some of the successful examples on how other organizations and other countries have worked together to do risk assessments to respond to complying with the Financial Action Task Force recommendation rather than introducing laws.
Great, thank you so much, Rose. Okay, so I know we're almost close to time. I'm gonna commit the cardinal sin and have us go a little bit over for folks who can stay. We've got two more great responses that we want to hear from Rose and Vanja. So Rose, we're gonna stay with you. And as you noted, you'd share a bit more with us on the specifics of Zimbabwe. So we'd love to hear that.
Thank you. So maybe just to highlight that Zimbabwe probably has been listed as one of the countries where there are bad practices around complying with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations because of the manner in which the government has responded. So with the Zimbabwean case, the government has taken the opportunity to introduce repressive legislation that would lead to criminalization of civil society organizations' work or not-for-profit organizations' work by stating that these laws are being proposed for introduction to comply with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. The first attempt to introduce a law under the guise of complying with the Financial Action Task Force recommendation was in 2021, in November 2021. The law was passed by Parliament in January 2023, but it was not signed into law by the President. The law then lapsed in August 2023. In terms of our processes in Zimbabwe, once a law is introduced by a parliament, then the parliament should finalize the law before that parliament is dissolved. And normally parliament is dissolved when an election is called. So that law has recently been introduced on the 1st of March 2024 with different and more elaborate provisions around how the government seeks to comply with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. It is interesting to note that in this new law that the government is reintroducing, they have a whole section where they try and define what the Financial Action Task Force is about and how the country is a member of the Financial Action Task Force and all the evaluation processes that the country has gone through. But interestingly enough, they do not mention that Recommendation 8 has been revised, and there's an interpretive note that has been provided by the Financial Action Task Force. In this new proposal, they also even talk about risk assessments, but the problematic provisions that have been highlighted in the past, in the lapsed law of 2021, have been carried forward into this new law with more problematic provisions around registration, where they now expand the scope of application of that law. So what I do see going ahead from the Zimbabwean experience, and also looking at experiences of colleagues from the Southern Africa Development Community region, like Mozambique, and also referring to what Claudia was mentioning in Latin America, is that there is an opportunity for the civil society organizations in Zimbabwe and civil society organizations from the region to engage the government around the new position, particularly with the revisions of the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, for them to reconsider the provisions of this law. This process is starting afresh, so there is a possibility to engage the parliament when they are debating the law, but also more importantly, because of the composition of parliament, it will be important for us to have the East and Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group also taking a more visible role in terms of guiding the government around complying with Recommendation 8. The challenge that we have at the moment is that our parliament is almost a one-party parliament. It's heavily leaning towards the ruling party, and the ruling party has been actively championing the closure of civic space. So it would help if the FATF-style regional body for East and Southern Africa also is actively involved in terms of engaging the government as well as the Financial Action Task Force to ensure that this law that they are reintroducing, and where they are now putting more objectives around complying with the Financial Action Task Force, is actually in compliance with the revised and the interpretive note of the Financial Action Task Force on Recommendation 8, to prevent the passage of this law, because once it passes, it will be very difficult to reverse this. And for the NPO sector in Zimbabwe, we are also looking forward to receiving the usual support that we have received from some of the stakeholders that are involved in this webinar, particularly the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, and also the Global Not-for-Profit Coalition on FATF, to assist us in lobbying, engaging, and advocating with government and different stakeholders. In the past, we have noted that some of the interventions that we have received from the partners have really helped, even for the government to acknowledge the work that we are doing in terms of advocating for changes in this law, particularly with the direct conduct that the Global NPO Coalition has with the Financial Action Task Force, for them to reconsider the position of the law and make sure that it's compliant. The government is acknowledging that there's need to do risk assessments, but the manner in which they are proposing to do the risk assessments in this proposed law is not compliant with what the Financial Action Task Force would recommend. And for us, we think it's critical that we are hosting you are hosting the webinar at this time, especially considering the precarious situation that is in Zimbabwe, to prevent the law from passing and other countries from the SADC region from emulating the bad law that Zimbabwe is going to pass. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Rose. And yeah, big shout out to the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law for their support of you. And I think I speak for the whole FATF coalition when we say we will continue to support all of these efforts in Zimbabwe, and then noting what you said about how other countries in the region will likely follow suit if it passes. So we are to our final question, back to Vanja. So Vanja, the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law, whereas we noted before, you're the program director, put out a great resource last December on navigating the 2023 changes of FATF Recommendation 8 and the best practices paper. So we applaud you for putting out this tool so quickly. And in the spirit of what we talked about before, about trying to bridge the gap between the normative and country level, could you share with us some of the key takeaways from this resource and how civil society at the national, regional, and local level can best utilize it?
Thank you so much, Ashley. And just quickly to wrap up and building on what Rose has said, it really echoes the national efforts, and it's a living resource. So everything is still added in this resource. In short, what we identified that CSOs can and should ask on a national level is the following. First of all, the sustained outreach. So emphasis of the guidance that we should ask for is the outreach and engagement of civil society in all of these processes on national level, also including the mitigating measures and legislation being adopted as a continuous dialogue. This is what specifically the guidance says. The second one is measures of the oversight. And the focus here is really on proportionate monitoring, not one size fits all laws, for example. So this should be noted and advocated, as Rose mentioned. Also putting in place measures that are actually in use already and existing as self-regulatory sector mechanisms to address the risk. So this is something that countries often overlook, but now the guidance paper and best practice paper specifically points to that. So this is something that CSOs can actually offer instead of the regulation. There is a clarification that civil society organizations are not reporting entities under Recommendation 8 and should not conduct the classic customer due diligence process. So if this is happening, this is something that civil society can flag to the governments that is contrary to the standards. And then there's to-do list in terms of possible measures that the countries can take, but also, as we mentioned before, not to-do list, the negative practices. And I would actually encourage all the CSOs to check the not to do list. And if any of the practices that your country is currently doing are on this list, please get in touch, and we should actually notify the FATF and raise concerns about it, because this is not aligned with the Recommendation 8 requirement. And this list can be found in the best practice paper in one of the boxes as examples. And then finally, there is also a short paragraph on providing additional information to FATF about country situation. And there are a couple of resources that are considered reliable resources that FATF will take into consideration, including domestic and international documents and reports, case studies and reports from nonprofit organizations, and reports from intergovernmental organizations. So if you have any reports or know of any, for example, UN or other reports that flag the situation in your country, please use it to also flag it to the FATF and use it as a resource. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanja. And a big thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for being here with us today. And thank you for sharing your time and expertise. Thank you to everyone who joined us and who stayed with us through to the end. I think we're going to end here. But if you do have questions, I think you have all of our contacts, so please feel free to reach out. And if there's a certain person you want to speak to and you don't have their contact, we will be sure to put you in touch. So maybe just a quick sum up would be to say that the revisions to Recommendation 8 and the Interpretive Note and the best practices paper are a good step forward, but as we heard from folks, they're just a first step. So there's still a lot of work for all of us to be done, both in our national context and local and regional contexts, but also together in all of our continued advocacy to the FATF. So thank you so much. Really appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you, Ashley, and the CSN team.
We're a bit late to our next thing, so I think we're gonna jump.
Okay, we'll do debrief later. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ashley.
Bye.
Bye.
Ashley, thanks for everything. Bye.
Yeah, thank you as
Cheers,
well.
bye.
Bye.